And so we begin. So what I elected to do, it's, thank you. I usually have that capability. Let's see. So what I elected to do was to try to get through before our next, and we surely will, is to do the remaining portion of tissue and certainly the integument, so that when we get into lab a week from Monday, we'll be able to jump right onto the bones themselves. Because it's to me, it's about the most fun part that you have right away. Bones and joints are a lot of fun. So we'll even probably get started with bone and lecture. So this is the first. We did the first building block. It's the outer covering. So outer in the sense of externally, but external is also lining your mouth, your alimentary canal, your genitourinary canals, the openings effectively into the outer world. What they are, basically, they're not inside of you. By definition, they're not sterile tissue. They are covered in they're all covered in microorganisms until maybe, with the exception, and even then, there's a fair amount of them in the stomach and the small intestine. And the large intestine is just immensely filled. I mean, 10 times as many microorganisms along the lining of the large intestine, bacteria, read that, as there are cells themselves. So it's filled. So you have these limited areas, and they effectively serve as boundaries. So that's what we looked at last time. All those wonderful names you need to remember: simple and stratified, squamous, cuboidal, columnar, transitional, non-keratinizing, and non-keratinizing is everything but skin, the epidermal aspect of the skin. And we will look at the skin much more in detail. And the skin's another one of those units we do not just the anatomy here, but we'll do the physiology. So we'll get it into skin injury, skin repair. I try to do cancers in every single unit that we do. That's where it's applicable. So because as you'll see, when we're dealing with purely nerve and muscle tissue, since they are so highly, and the term that we use is differentiated. So are you familiar with the term differentiation? Good. So I mean, basically to summarize it, a cell in a growing embryo or fetus, comparatively speaking, they are relatively undifferentiated. If you will, they start as stem cells. So that, go back, everybody see the very attractive little second grader girl? Yes, no? You weren't looking. We'll go back. Hey, I look at your granddaughter. Oh, never mind, right? You don't have, what did I do with it? I lost it. All right, we'll go back to it. So if you remember that very pretty girl with the curly hair, the curls are that's from my eldest. That's why he wears a buzz cut, because it's always been like that since he was teeny tiny. Doesn't like the curl type of thing. So when I talk about undifferentiated cells, so where do we find them? And indeed, we can harvest them. So we'll harvest those kinds of stem cells as we become more acquainted with the usage of stem cells, particularly in what? Anybody know off the top of their head? When a baby's born, what do some parents do in order to harvest stem cells just in case? Cord blood. Okay, is that ringing a bell? Because theoretically, you're going to have cord blood that you could process in some way, shape, or form in the future and use to help. Now, why am I pointing out my granddaughter, whose name is Malin? That's Maelin, because her mom is Swedish. Her family is. I mean, she's from Massachusetts. Go figure. He married a Patriots fan. Where did I go wrong? I know. The Patriots fan. Like the only Patriot in my household we talk about is Tom Brady. And my wife feels now she has a chance because she and Giselle have split. So she's hoping. So I told her, in a pinch, I take Giselle. But I guess her trainer, kind of got there ahead of me. She figures she's got a shot. I'm okay with that. I'm okay. Hey, it's all right. I mean, there was in the class that preceded you, someone was very disappointed when Mr. Pickett became no longer eligible. What? Not your type? Okay, hey, that's why the good Lord made vanilla and chocolate. Right? It's a choice. Personally, for me, mint chocolate chip. In particular, the Giant Eagle mint chocolate chip moose tracks. It's a food moment. You gotta have a food moment. Tonight we're doing beef and broccoli with cashews. Asian style. I have to stop at Giant Eagle and pick up some odds and ends. You don't like Asian food? Okay. You make it yourself? Do you make it yourself? I'll make note of that. I have a very nice picture of me with the grandkids doing cooking. Back to my granddaughter. So that very pretty granddaughter, and I tell the classes this, okay, was born with a pediatric stroke. Okay. And you saw her there in those pictures with the smiley cookie, holding on to her brother by the beach out there on the Atlantic. That's Jacksonville Beach or Mayport Beach. That's where he's based in the Navy. And she suffered a stroke that we did not discover. They're both byproducts of IVF, fertilization. So we did not discover that. My daughter-in-law became preeclamptic, okay, and almost went critical. Frankly, I think it was lost her. But no one really knew, and it began to demonstrate itself months after. And if I told you, and I have the MRI somewhere, when I saw the MRI, I didn't even want to talk to her because I'd have to be clinical about it. But here's what they were told: you'll be fortunate if she can talk and if she can walk. Oh, now try to stop her. Okay. The reality, why I mentioned the cord blood and the whole idea why they got me on that tangent of undifferentiation, is my daughter-in-law's mom and dad, okay, paid for a cord blood treatment up at Duke University Medical Center within the last year and a half. Though she had been remarkable improvement, not from the cord blood, but since the time she was born. There are still physical limitations. She has what are called flexion contractures. The stroke was left-sided. She's totally left. Everything is left. The right is limited. You'll see other pictures. You may notice it. The way she walks, it is impactful because she's dominant left. She swings. She's developing some degree of scoliosis. They're going to have to deal with a pediatric consult. So it's not. It's very interesting. But I said to them when this all happened, the plasticity is the term we use, the adaptability or plasticity of the human brain, of which she has arguably half of what you and I probably have as much. But it's remarkable what it can do. So the idea of differentiation is the ability for these cells, what controls it, how we trigger it, whether it's chemicals, whether it's electrical current, what the signaling mechanisms are inside of us, is not terribly clear. But what it does do is allow those cells to develop. And in the brain particularly, it's more about interconnections, synapses, which we'll cover, which many of you are familiar with the term. Some people say synapse. I say synapse. And effectively, that's where nerves come together and make a variety of, literally billions of pathways, perhaps trillions of pathways. They're able to adapt and overcome those things. So that's undifferentiated. Epithelial lining cells, like we just covered, are poorly differentiated, or relatively speaking, undifferentiated cells. The good news is they replicate like crazy. The good news is they replace themselves almost as rapidly as you can talk about it. They're very, very quick, which means if they're damaged, we make new ones right away. Bad news is, because they're so highly replicative, when irregularities occur for various reasons, they're the ones that are most prone to cancers. That's why we call them carcinomas. What we're dealing with next are cells that are a little bit more under control, but still replicative for the most part. with certain nuances that we'll cover. And in that particular aspect of things, those effectively, the cancers are less frequent, but frequently more problematic. They're called sarcomas when we're dealing with the next unit, which are connective tissues. And when you get to, and where I started this, when you get to nerve and muscle, actual nerves going, or actual skeletal or cardiac or smooth muscle, it's extraordinarily rare because they're so highly differentiated. They basically, if they're damaged, it's not like they don't make new ones. They just get damaged and they end up with faulty. So we don't see malignant changes. And the term, understand, tumor and malignant are not interchangeable terms. Okay. And they're often used that way. In some areas they are. Like if you have, like I had a lining cancer and transitional epithelium, they're all malignant. The first thing I asked the surgeon. The surgeon was the lead guy here. It still is at Allegheny Health, Allegheny General. He's the tumor guy. So he said, "Hey, they're all cancers." So just giving you some context. So that's the jumping off point, and we'll go from there. Long-winded. So you'll find, unfortunately, maybe for good and for bad, that I have a lot of examples of things that happened in my family, and that's my context for understanding reproductive physiology. My first wife and I were unable to have children biologically, though we tried everything. And it was days before where things like IVF was in its infancy, surrogate parenting was in its infancy. Well, people were doing that. People looked at you like you were, opposing, the Almighty. If you want, how I'm trying to phrase it so it's not controversial, but a lot of people thought you're tinkering around. So we had to be very quiet about how those things. So I understand. I have context for stuff that's happened to me and other members of my family that are interesting. But if you live to be 72 years old, you get a few of those coming. Just saying. Not happy about it. Okay. Connective tissues. These are more advanced, but again, and they are the most abundant and widely distributed. Got more of that than anything else. And number one on the hit parade is the major protein they're made of. You've all heard the name collagen. Okay? Binding, support. They connect, protect, they insulate fatty tissue, store and reserve fuel, fatty tissue again. Blood, which by definition, connective tissues don't have to be hard or firm or thick. They can be liquid. There's no rule. There's three simple things they have to have. They got to have cells. They got to have fibers. Okay, and they have to have something that contains those elements that we typically call a ground substance. And when we combine the ground substance and the fibers together, we have what's referred to in a lot of authors, this one included, called the matrix. And depending on how the fibers are arranged, they can be super solid, they can be very, very loose, they can be semi-solid, or they can be liquid like blood. Why is blood liquid? Because those fibers are very famous. They're called fibrinogen. And the O-gen is the clue. O-gen means it's in a precursor state. You're going to learn in digestive all about zymogens, enzymes in their precursor stage, because when they're activated, they get busy. Well, the fibrinogen in its precursor stage is dissolved in your blood. What happens when the clotting cascade, for whatever reason, is initiated? Let's say you cut yourself. Relatively common, though by no means the most frequent reason that system is activated. At that point, those fibrinogens, effectively the end product of the clotting cascade, is to generate an enzyme that will convert fibrinogen to something called fibrin, which is insoluble. And when it comes out of solution, it forms, for lack of a better term, and there's a wonderful illustration about it in this and many texts, it looks like a fishnet. And it traps red cells. And they become a clot. Well done. You got to give the design people credit. I always feel that's important. You're doing a good job. When I go to the casino next, remember I'm complimenting you. I'm hoping, like one day. So the four main classes: proper connective tissues. When you talk about connective tissues, these are ones that are relatively soft. Some are a little firmer, some are a little denser. Cartilage, which I would define as semi-solid, there's a certain amount of, it's like almost like rubberized. If you think of like, the material that your phone case for the most part is made out of. There's a certain amount of give to it depending on how it's composed. And bone, which is solid, and blood, which is liquid. Nerves and muscles are kinds of tissues. We do entire units on those, particularly so in physiology. So we'll come back to them. And this is a great chart because it's just arranged perfectly. So it's one of those things that I look at and I kind of go, commit to memory, if you can. You have 3 types of loose, convenient, love 3s. You're going to see a lot of 3s. 3 types of dense, 3 types of cartilage. Okay, loose connective tissue that has and what makes it loose is that the fibers are not closely back together. The distinction, let's say, just to draw a better focus on it. Remember when I drew my what gift artwork? A big sheet. These, so the cells are not only connected to something they hold on to, but to each other. Connective tissue, cell here, cell here, cell here, fibers. Okay. So the cells are not next to each other, they're space. What's in the space? In loose areolar, it's air. They're airy. Okay? And loose areolar connective tissue underlies every epithelial tissue. Doesn't matter whether it's the epidermis of your skin, it doesn't matter whether it's lining a blood vessel, there's a teeny tiny amount of loose areolar connective tissue. Blood vessels and nerves are located in there because remember, epithelial tissue does not have any direct blood supply. Everything it gets is by diffusion. Okay? Oxygen and nutrients diffuse in, carbon dioxide and waste products diffuse out or are eliminated some other way. Like think of perspiration might be something along those lines. Adipose tissue. Now, with those spaces are typically filled with air, but we can effectively take the same tissue and add a storage vessel. What's fat? Fat is energy storage. It's very simple what our body does. It's not complex at all. I mean, obviously it's genetically based. It's based on activity. It's based on diet. Of late, I have an addiction to mint Oreos. Now, and they're good. Like Oreo cookies? At least I'm not among strangers. The other class I had yesterday, I talked about Spaceballs. They all looked at me like, what's that? Took every fiber of my being, not that. And my gift for restraint.
Isn't Spaceballs just a ripoff of Star Wars?
Of course it is. It's a parody, not a ripoff. It's a parody. Right? You call it tomato, I'll call it tomato. You have a ketchup t-shirt on anyway. Mel Brooks, he did the same thing with Robin Hood, Men in Tights. He did it on Western. Okay, very famously with a movie that nobody would watch today because of all the language it's in it. He was poking fun at all the language, Blazing Saddles. He did it on the movie industry with a wonderful movie, his first ever called The Producers. Which starred Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder, and it became an extraordinarily successful stage musical. It's not a ripoff so much as it's for fun.
He's just making fun of it.
He's making fun of it.
Okay.
It wasn't Darth Vader, it was Dark Helmet.
I remember that, yeah.
Okay, it wasn't the Force, it was just Schwartz. Major Schwartz be with you. That's all. They weren't destroying planets, they were sucking the air out of them. And at the same time, he made fun of Planet of the Apes. How that evolved at the very end of the movie. Just offhand. Areolar, adipose. Okay, so fat goes in there. So what does your body do? If you eat too much of something, what's going to happen to it? Your body has a way of dealing with things. It takes care of carbs first, right? Then it processes fats, then it goes to proteins. So as long as there's an abundance of carbs, it will use that to satisfy your energy. But you can't store carbohydrates and you can't store excess ATP. If you haven't used it within a minute, it's got to be stored and it's converted to fat. The reverse of that, that one of those Dr. Hilwig cycles, beta oxidation, that type of things. Am I ringing a bell, people? See, you can learn something. Okay, so you flip, so we can staple those wonderful acetyl units together. Okay, so you have to understand the way it works. If you spare the carbohydrates, keto or ketogenic diets, which started way back with the South Beach diet and things along those lines, where there which effectively, and they've been around, was called Cambridge diet when it originally came out. I have gained and lost people. I've weighed as much in my adult life as 280 pounds and as little as 167, and generally hover somewhere in between, depending on all of those dietary things. So what happens if you spare that, and that diet ingests a high quantity of relatively healthy fats, bad fats and good fats. You probably learned all that stuff already, and then and a comparatively minimal amount of proteins. So what happens is, if you don't use the carbs, now you start to break apart fat. That's why it's such a positive diet, because you start to lose inches right away. It's good news. So when you put your pants on, it's like, oh wow, they just didn't fit the last whatever. So what happens here? These are the areas under the lining tissue. Where do we store fat? Some places we have fat naturally, around the kidney, around the heart, protective for certain organs, protective around joints. You have naturally occurring fatty pads, just things to protect bony prominences, etc. The fat generally shows itself up abdominally, hips, thighs, that type of area. And women, breast tissue will pick it up. So those are all areas where we begin to see that. So somebody goes on a diet where you're gobbling up the fat, those areas proportionately to theoretically improve. Okay, so adipose is basically the same tissue, I think, but just filled with fat cells that are there. Understand there's still a ton of blood vessels and nerves, and that's one of the problems with excessive body weight. You're putting a burden on your heart, as well as on your liver. It's that the whole idea of what's going on. Reticular is very interesting. It has specialized kinds of fibers. Is there something I said? Or has he got practice?
Water.
Well, he needs water.
Yeah.
I feel better.
Why?
I thought it was something I said.
No.
Okay. Oh, yours. There's nothing to be sorry about. It's naturally occurring spasm. Okay. So reticular fibers are coated, very skinny collagen fibers. And what happens to them, and this is again another analogous type of situation, where they form almost like a strainer, like a fine mesh strainer that you would use at home. Okay, if you're straining some coffee grounds out, if you were doing some type of recipe where you had to strain out the material that's there. So it looks like a fine mesh strainer. And we find it in certain areas, particularly like in the spleen or lymphatic tissues, because they're straining out damaged red blood cells, for instance. That's there. So, and reticulars are also in the bone marrow, and we'll talk about that when you look at the blood, which is more of a physiology than an anatomy thing, because it's almost like blood kind of comes out, and as it goes through the strainer, you'll get a parent, and little cells or cellular-like forms will come out. So when we start talking about dense, it's just that. The fibers, there's a lot more of them than what I drew over there. Okay, they're dense. Are they regularly arranged or not? Is there a predominance of elastic fibers? And I'll go through all of these. We'll get to cartilage afterwards. So the cells of all of these, to the same, and this is a fascinating thing about the human body. We go back to those stem cells. One form of those stem cells makes these things called fibroblasts. The difference between blast and site. A blast means active and busy. It's rapidly producing fibers and ground substance and more cells. Okay. A site is, relatively speaking, quiescent. It's still doing that stuff, just not as rapidly. Think of it that way. In an injury, the fibrocytes will convert back to fibroblasts and get busy again. So you cut yourself, you scrape yourself. The dog does it to me again. Okay? I thought it was something I said. I don't know. Probably something about the Schwartz being with you. It's okay. It's all right. It's I'm old. I can accept it. Okay. The idea of this is when something like damage like that occurs, and all of a sudden it stimulates these processes to change. So when you're looking at a microscopic slide, or we'll just project micrographs, you're going to see them mostly in the site form. Maybe some will be in the blast form. Yes, the cells that are also in that area, we have a vast amount of white blood cells. They are defensive cells. They're part of your primary defenses. They're the cellular arm of your what's called your innate immune system. They're always there. Okay? And adipocytes, there's always a certain amount of fatty tissue that's there. You have a ground substance that's more gel-like and soft, and you have all three types of fibers: collagen, most abundant and thickest; elastic, a little thinner, and effectively it's made of elastin, and it's stretchy, for lack of a better term. So we have things that are designed to be stretchy. And then the reticular fibers, which are similar to collagen, but skinnier and coated. So varying density and types, binding, mechanical stress, energy, blah, 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 blah. When we get to cartilage, and you'll see we'll go through all of these. When we get to cartilage, it's a little bit different. So in cartilaginous tissue, it's the fibroblast can morph into what's called a chondroblast, and can morph again into an osteoblast. Because our skeleton, for the most part, starts as fibers, becomes cartilaginous, and it's a very, very versatile cell, a kind of stem cell, but already on a dedicated pathway. So here you have a chondrocyte or chondroblast, and it's secreting fibers and ground substance in a wide pattern. The combination of those it happens in such a way that it begins to firm up. And what we see, and you'll see it better on the micrographs, is we see an area surrounding it that looks like a little cavity. Okay, and anatomists, when they saw it microscopically, gave it a name. They called it a lacuna. Lacuna. Okay. So it looked like its own little house. Like it's like, here's the cell, like it's perfect. Got a house of its own. I don't think that's really the case. A lot of things we see in cellular anatomy, in microscopic anatomy, are optical illusions. Things that don't stain. My guess is this is something that just does not stain appears clear. When we get the skin, where your skin is thick, like on your palms and your soles, you have a layer of skin called the stratum lucidum. Effectively, there's a layer of cells there that, for whatever reason, don't stain as we're transitioning from living. So a lot of these are optical illusions, and I'll qualify this as we move on. So you see, so effectively, in short, if you look here, it generally stains fairly uniform. By far and away, the cartilage we have the most of, and it strictly has collagen fibers, is called hyaline cartilage. Your whole respiratory tract, the cartilage here of your nose, your trachea, the bronchi into the lungs, okay, all that. And we'll get into that extensively. Elastic cartilage only has two places. It has elastic fibers as well as the collagen. The ear, okay, and the other one, very famously, is the oddball in the respiratory, the epiglottis. So when you swallow, it covers the opening into the larynx and down into your bronchi and theoretically into your lungs. Like your mom said, don't talk when you eat. And then fibrocartilage, very interesting, very timely because we're in sports season. Fibrocartilage are classically the intervertebral discs. So there's a great deal of firmer, denser material as well as the cartilage itself. And it's also the menisci in the knees. So those are the knee cartilages. And the knee is not the only joint that has extra cartilage. Your temporomandibular joint has extra cartilage. Okay? Your sternoclavicular joint has extra cartilage. When you put something in a joint like that, it enhances its range of motion. Okay, that's what it basically does in the knee. It changes the joint from being relatively flat into more of what's called a condyloid joint. So it can move in two planes, flex and extend, and internally and externally rotate. Just saying. I did this for a living. I know this stuff. A lot of stuff I don't know. Chondroblasts versus chondrocytes. When the cartilage is funny. Cartilage doesn't have any blood supply, and blood kills cartilage. Ah, blood degrades cartilage. How? Your skeleton, for the most part, when you were born, was made out of cartilage. When did it make the transition to bone? When it was invaded by blood vessels. And we'll see this when we do the bone unit. So if you're an athlete, or even if you're just you and me who aren't terribly athletic, or somewhere in between, and you twist your ankle and there's blood goes into the joint, that joint eventually is going to have some degree of deterioration. You could have full-blown post-traumatic arthritis, or you could just have, my knee hurts every so often. Okay. Why? Because the blood, as it clots, adheres to the cartilage, the hyaline cartilage that lines every joint, and effectively creates an area, focal point of damage. When you open up a joint to look at it in surgery, a beautiful joint, it's pristine, it's white, it's perfect. When you open up an arthritic joint to remove bone spurs or to do an implant arthroplasty, putting in a new joint, totally different. It's either super rock hard or soft, it's irregular, it's pockmarked. It ain't pretty. I used to say it in my old neighborhood. Yes, sir.
So the sac around your joints, it's called bolsa.
The sac enclosing your joint is a capsule. Where structures may rub, and not all joints have them, your knee does, your shoulder, your elbow, you get little sacs of fluid that are called bursa. Okay, hence the term bursitis. Some of them are always there. Those are called fixed bursae, and some develop because of friction and pressure from an activity. Or in the days when the ladies wore a lot of high heels, they made when their foot was up like this, their ankle was unstable, and they got a thing called a pump bump. The back of the heel, pump bump. High heel shoes were called pumps. My daughter went from 5'4" to 5'8" a lot of times when she was going out. And some, like the stack heel type. Oh God. Yes, sir. Pardon me? Yes. Absolutely. It can burst by intent, and it can burst accidentally as well. There's sufficient amount of trauma. If you've had much trauma to tear a bursa, it's pretty bad. By and large, they become inflamed because it's hard objects. It's skin against bone, tendon against bone, bone against bone, something firm, muscles and tendons rubbing against each other. So they're like Mother Nature's guards to friction and pressure, just like you would you put down something on your countertop if you're putting a hot pot on. Trivet. Right. Yeah, it could be that. But some people get more punctures. There's a lot of it. Like I see it, Bruce, you're sleeping. Yeah, I make fun of some. But I'm the kind of person who could. I think I did it in Costco. It's a great story. So it's a few years ago. It's 7 years. So I was over 65 when she was. We had we had forester at the top. The lid came off. Actually, putting stuff in there. She closed it before my head out. Okay. And all of a sudden, there's people around us, and you can hear them. And all of a sudden, I start hollering, elder abuse, elder abuse. That was my kids. And they had to start to get, technology and stuff. I get mad and they go, 1-800 for a child. And I got it the other way right now. Elder abuse. Go ahead, you have children. Tell a story. Take my kids, please. Please. It's an old joke by a guy named Henny Youngman, the king of the one-liners. He'd get up in front of the audience on the Ed Sullivan Show. I know. Look it up, sir.
I broke my hand.
Yes.
I broke like a metacarpal head.
Right.
I was wondering, bursa didn't burst, then I wouldn't have arthritis in the future.
Yeah, it's less likely about the burst. It's more about where the joint damage was. If there was bleeding into the joint, yeah, down the road you could become arthritic. It's not a joint that's weight bearing, so you're probably better off. It's not. It's going to affect. It catches up with you down the road. Who did you?
I accidentally punched the table.
Sure. What was his name?
Table.
The usual one you get from punching somebody is here. Notice my knuckles. This one, it's called a boxer's fracture. Head of the fifth metacarpal, you dislocated. We frequently see that in traumatology.
Doctor said it's like people break their hand. It's usually like in the middle of the metacarpal.
Depends on nature. If you're striking somebody, it's here. It's the most common area by far and away. There's certain things like a kid with stitches. So some of you probably aspire to work somewhere in the healthcare tree. This is serious. This is serious back there. Chelsea's roommate.
What?
No, I didn't say anything.
No, okay, first of all, it's Hannah.
I know it's Hannah. I'm giving you a hard time. All right. Hannah, Chelsea's roommate.
Right.
No, the reason I'm saying it's serious. If you're going to work around health, it doesn't matter if you're in healthcare. If you see a little kid kids fall and get hurt, it's not all evidence of child abuse, okay? We're going to talk about this. But if, the most common areas for stitches in a child, and I had both of them, forehead, they bend, they run into something, they bend over, and here, your chin. They'll lean on something, it gives way and whack right there. If you see that, it's rarely child abuse. If you see a dislocated shoulder, it's child abuse. Okay? It's child abuse until proven otherwise. And we'll talk about this when we start talking about joints. So, and that's why I'm being serious. I love to have a good time, and I like to do the funny stories and all that stuff. And I have a zillion of those anecdotes. But the reality is that I'm trying to get certain points across in that regard about those things. It's just like telling you about my granddaughter. That can happen to anybody. It doesn't matter. We couldn't have kids biologically, and turns out they couldn't have kids biologically. Sometimes what goes around comes around. Whatever you want to talk about. At least the IVF worked for them. It didn't work for us. It was in the early days. So, as you can see here, those are the different cartilaginous tissues that are there. What do? The ground substance is a little thicker. The fibers are more abundant, okay? Depending, and sometimes there's combinations of fibers. We'll get to the specific. Resist compression because there's a lot of water that's in there. Cushion and support. When we get to bone, we do a whole unit on bone. This particular bone that kind of looks like a tree trunk is called, that's the osteon. That's the functional unit and structural unit of bone. This is cortical bone. Bone is think of a cylinder, which is very thick, like a stainless steel tube that's quite thick around the rim. The cortex, this is the rim. As it gets to the interior, it changes into something called cancellous or spongy bone. We'll get into all that. And then blood, we do a whole separate chapter on. Same deal, osteoblasts and osteocytes. Yeah, you're going to see there's lacunae there. But in contrast to cartilage, which has no blood supply and indeed is damaged by blood, bone has the best blood supply around. Bone heals. As long as the pieces of bone are close to each other and not moving around, not far apart, they're going to heal. Very hard tissue, because in addition to its construction that you will see, in addition to that, it tends to attract calcium and phosphate and some magnesium and phosphate. And that hardens it even more. So bone's really strong. And we'll get to the blood separately. So 3 characteristics all have a common embryonic origin, arise from mesenchymal tissue or mesenchyme, varying degrees of vascularity, cartilage none, bone a ton. They are suspended. The cells are within, trying to use my terrible illustration, and what's called an ECM or extracellular matrix. The mesh is made out of a combination of proteins and sugars. Did Dr. Hillwig talk to you guys? Maybe a biochemist who gets that. Proteoglycans, glycosamine. And their structure is really important. Like back in the chemistry lab when you're cleaning out test tubes, I was a chem major. I know. I had the world's smartest roommate, not roommate, a lab partner. Okay. That's why it's a great story. Don't Google people when you get older. You missed. When Google came around, I hadn't talked to her in 20 years. I knew she was a college professor in New York State. What do I get when I Googled her name? Her obituary. It's like 48 years old, treasured head of chemistry department, was long battle with cancer, husband and daughter survived. Never again, but she's much smarter than I. So what happens with regard to that, those bottle brushes in the chemistry lab for test tubes and flasks and all those good things, look at the way that they're ran. Imagine if that material in the space between those brushes, if there was something that would attract water. That's what they look like. So magically, there's so much surface area of this protein and sugar, these proteoaminoglycans, that they suck up the water. That, and it gives it that remarkable degree of density. So it supports the cells, they bear weight, withstand tension, blah. Ground substance, fibers, and cells. The first two elements, by definition, they call it the matrix. And the variations come from there. Ground substance, unstructured, things can flow through it depending on how densely packed it is with cells. When we get to tendons and ligaments, you're going to see why when someone tears, and it's how many people have done that recently, an ACL, an anterior cruciate ligament, it's dense connective tissue. It does not heal. There's no blood supply. There's no room for stuff to diffuse into it. So you can try, like we did way back in the 70s, long before we had technology, we just sewed them together and people were going to lose a certain amount of function. Not a whole lot you could do about it. Now we graft them all the time. And indeed, we graft them with a variety of things. You can do autografts using your own tissue. You can use xenografts using tissue from another species. There's a variety of cadaver bone and cadaver grafts are utilized. All of those are used commonly in ACL surgery. So there's a lot of nuances with regard to that. All this leads into it. So, because depending on that ground substance, you can't get through because the fibers are so thick. So, a glue for attachment, adhesion proteins, the proteoglycans, chondroitin sulfate, and hyaluronic acid, those are part of cartilage. So, a lot of people, and they're going to tell you that people that will say it doesn't work. A lot of people with arthritis take supplements with hyaluronic acid, chondroitin sulfate, very often with MSM. Like that, you go to Costco, go to Giant Eagle, go anywhere, go to Sam's, you can get big jars of it. Worked for me for a long time. I couldn't hold a golf club for a while, and then all of a sudden, taking that, it really helped. So some people are very, it depends. Maybe it was all up here. So collagen, strongest and most abundant. Elastic, thin, elastin fibers, they stretch. Reticular, very fine, branched, different chemistry and form. And there's a certain amount of give, but it's really that strainer kind of effect, that mesh that you see there. So blast are immature, secreting. And like I said, one can go to here, and go backwards. Okay, and there's also, when we get to the blood, you'll hear about it in the way you pronounce this, is hematopoietic stem cells in bone marrow. And sight is just the mature, not inactive, but less active. It's a good way to express it. And the other cells, we see everything. So that's the beauty. The next one I'll show you on Friday is loose, areal, or connective tissue. It's got all this. It's got fatty cells. It's got all the different white blood cells, more or less. It has mast cells, which are so critical in allergy, in anaphylactic shock, and hives, and those kinds of things that we talk about mostly next term. And my favorite cell, personally, the macrophage, big eater. What it means. I want to be reincarnated as a macrophage. What'd you do all day? I ate a lot of debris. My dog could be a macrophage. No need for a 5-second rule in our house. He's faster than that. And so I'll leave you with this slide. So this is an example. The yellowish ones are elastin. These are the collagen. They're trying to make those the reticulin. These would be nerves that are present. This is a blood vessel, a capillary, fatty cells. That's called a PMN or a neutrophil or poly, stands for polymorphonuclear leukocyte. Here you can see the mast cell that's filled with histamine granules, sometimes with heparin and other substances, a lymphocyte, and there's that macrophage with all those wonderful tentacle-like projections. See you Friday. Thanks very much. Thanks for putting up, by the way, thanks for putting up with me. I'm a little crazy. It's what we like to say, Miss Sugar. Term you should be familiar with.